Hello, welcome to my session on how to automate your MariaDB or MySQL infrastructure with Ansible. Federico Razzoli here. Some words about me. I am founder and director at Vetabase. Vetabase is a very young database consulting company. It provides consulting for some database technologies, including MariaDB and MySQL. We have a focus on database automation. We especially work with startups and we help them with the typical technological challenges they deal with when they have built their product or most of it, and then very quickly they have to scale it. And when it comes to scaling, the database is typically the hardest component to deal with. I am a database consultant since a very long time. I'm an open source supported. I use MySQL since the year 2000. And I use MariaDB since before its first version became stable. So let's go on. What to expect from this talk? Well, I will start by explaining quickly and not in depth the general Ansible concepts. And then for the rest of the talk, I will show you some opinionated code examples on how to automate MariaDB or MySQL. Opinionated because I'm going to use these code examples to show you the good practice I think you should follow and the bad practice I think you shouldn't follow. If you don't know Ansible at all, well, you will not learn it with this talk, but you will get a feel of how it looks like to use Ansible, and hopefully you will get some useful hint on how to do things right. If you know Ansible already, you will hopefully get some good ideas and some insights on how to use it properly from the perspective of a database administrator. So an Ansible overview. So let's start from the very basics and explain what Ansible is. Ansible defines itself as a tool for deployment and configuration automation. So, for example, you can use it to deploy a new server, what runs on it, how the software is configured, and every aspect of your server, basically. It follows the infrastructure as code approach, so everything is described with a domain-specific language. Based on YAML, YAML. The code is idempotent, which means if you run it twice, the first time it will have the desired effect, and the second time it will change nothing. So, what does it mean in practice? It means that if you have a running server, you already deployed it, and you are totally free to change something in your code. So for example, you can change the version of some software and then apply the code again. Okay. The most part of the code you are applying again was already applied once, so it will not be executed again. So in practice, this means, first of all, you will not make any damage, and also it will be much faster because you don't do everything from the beginning every time. Okay, even if you don't do it manually, you want automation to be decently fast. It's also important to remember Ansible is as simple as possible and not centralized. So there is no such a thing like an Ansible server, and actually you are totally free to run it from your own laptop. So it is actually very common to have a DevOps team, and every member of the team has Ansible on their own laptop. This is not necessarily the best idea for several reasons, including security, but still it is very common and you can definitely do it. So I will briefly list basic Ansible concepts. I will not explain them in details because we will see them by example later. So important component is inventory. In inventory is typically a file which lists your servers and logical groups of your servers. Inventories can also be dynamic, which means they can retrieve the list of servers from remote services. This is very useful if your services are in the cloud, but we will not discuss this. A module is basically an Ansible object that you can use to interact with a certain system component. For example, some modules are system users, files, MySQL, and so on. A playbook is a file written in a domain-specific language, which basically uses modules to describe a system or part of a system. So a playbook should say, for example, that certain directories exist, certain system users exist, MySQL is running, and so on. It's a description of how a server looks like. Okay. A role is a playbook that describes a precise logical part of a system and applies to certain hosts or groups of hosts. So for example, a role could be MySQL, and it describes everything that is needed to have MySQL up and running. A play is a file that associates certain host groups to their roles. Variables are very important and should be used for every part of a system that could change over time. So typical example is software version. Every software version should be in a variable, so to update or downgrade, you simply change this value and apply the role again. Facts are information that Ansible retrieves from target hosts, and they are important because they allow Ansible to find out which parts of the code should be executed, which should not, because they were executed already. And often they also allow Ansible to find out how certain things should be done. Okay. So let's proceed by talking about inventories. This is a very simple example of inventory. You can see we have two groups, PMM. We have only one host in PMM group, but I think it's still a good idea to have a group. Why? Because in the future you could have two PMM servers, for example, and if you configure them for a group of servers, all you will have to do in theory is to just add another host in this group. The second group is MariaDB main. You can see we have 3 hosts. And then the last block of lines is variables for MariaDB main. So we are defining some variables in an inventory. This is not the most common place to define variables, but I think it is a good idea to define certain types of variables here. Particularly variables that are server names, server addresses, ports, because these things are very, very related to an inventory of servers. This is more or less the same example as before, but we are not using host names this time. Okay, so for example, PMM1 is not a host name, it is an alias. And is it an alias for what? Well, we have Ansible host, and the value of Ansible host is the actual IP that should be associated to that alias. Okay, so if we cannot or don't want to use meaningful host names, we can use meaningful aliases, and this will be very useful especially when we have many servers, because it becomes very easy to remember names of the servers you want to deploy and so on. Groups can be hierarchical, so you can see some groups here. You can see that we have MariaDB master, MariaDB replica, and then we have a supergroup called MariaDB. Okay, so we specify that the children of this group are MariaDB master and MariaDB replica. So what are the goals of a group? Well, you assign each group some roles instead of assigning roles to specific hosts, which would be very chaotic. Which is why, again, I suggest to always use groups, even groups that contain only one host. And then you can deploy one or more group instead of deploying individual hosts, or even worse, deploying the whole infrastructure every time. Okay. You can have, and probably you should have, multiple inventories. So for example, you could have one inventory for production and one for staging, but actually it's also recommended to group inventories by functions. So for example, have separate inventories for databases, another inventory for web servers, and so on. The reason, well, there are several reasons, but the most obvious reason is that these inventories are probably managed by different persons with different skills. So in this example, we have a production DB inventory and a staging DB inventory. As you can see, they define the same group and the same hosts, but actually the host aliases are the same. If you look at Ansible host, the IPs are different. So whichever inventory we decide to use, we will have the same aliases. We can deploy on these aliases, but depending if we are using production or staging, we will actually deploy to different servers. Let's talk about Blaze. Here you can see an example. It uses YAML, And so we are associating the role MariaDB main to a list of roles, and then the group MySQL main to another list of roles. I wanted to show something that I consider quite important. The list could include some roles in common. And this is actually something that I do every time. You can see that both the roles include, both the groups include a role called Linux for MySQL. Why? Because it does things that are needed both for MariaDB and for MySQL. So for example, it can create the proper file system. It could disable swappiness or set it to a very low value, and so on. And then we have two separate roles, one for MariaDB and one for MySQL. It is also important to say that roles are applied in order. So in this example, Linux for MySQL is applied first, and then MariaDB is applied. Here you can see an example of how to apply the roles. So we call Ansible Playbook, which is the tool used to apply playbooks and roles. We specify the inventory to use, staging. We specify the server, the hosts or the groups we want to deploy to. In this case, it is a group, and most of the times, probably it will be a group. And then we specify the play to use, because again, the play will associate the group MariaDB main to specific IPs. Here you can see another example. The first command is the same as before. The second command is almost the same. But in the first case, we are using the staging inventory. In the second case, we are using production inventory. So as I explained before, with a very simple change, we are deploying to different environments. So let's talk about some other very important components of Ansible, which are roles, variables, and templates. Okay, so what you see in this example is the most simple building block of an Ansible playbook or role. It is called a task. Okay, in this case, the task has a name, which is create script directory. The name is optional, but it's very important to set it, because when you apply a role, you will see the list of tasks executed. You will see it on your screen. Okay, if something fails, it's very important to use meaningful names for your tasks. Then we use we use file, which is a module, and for this module we specify some attributes. For example, we define a name, an owner, a group, and so on. But the name, to set the name, we are using a variable, which is script_dir. You can see the syntax that is used to use a variable in your tasks. I am using double quotes. If I use single quotes, it will not be considered a variable, it will be considered as a string. Okay, so how to define variables? Well, first of all, here you can see the syntax, which is again YAML, and there are several places to define variables. The most common choices are the ones listed here. So they can be listed in hostvars directory. The name of the file should correspond to a group name and should have the extension YML. In this case, the variable, of course, applies to the specified host. Then we have group vars, and those are, of course, variables that apply to a certain group. And then we have role defaults. Okay, so if a variable is not defined for a group or for a host, the default written here in the role will be applied. These locations are read for each individual host in this order. Okay, so if if a certain variable is found in host vars, it will be used. If it's not found, it will be searched in group vars, and so on. Some notes on variables. I think it's very important to say that the same variable can be used by multiple roles. Okay, as I shown before, a variable is not necessarily defined in a role. It can be defined for each group or even hosts. I didn't mention before, but there is an official repository of Ansible roles called Ansible Galaxy. But these roles are written to be extremely reusable, so they are general purpose, and they therefore cannot use this opportunity. But having variables used by several roles makes sense for your infrastructure. So what you should probably do in most cases is to have your own roles, which doesn't mean you have to write them from scratch, because it would be a long work. But you can actually use an existing role because they are generally open source, and you can modify the role depending on the needs of your specific infrastructure. Probably you should also drop a lot of stuff from the original role because, for example, roles are written to work with any Linux distribution, but you probably use only one Linux distribution and don't care about the others. Remember, whenever you decide that a variable is needed, document it in the README file in the role, or in a more generic README file in the repository that describes your infrastructure. So here you can see an example of how to copy a configuration file. This is very important, right? In this example, you can see we are copying a my.cnf file, MariaDB or MySQL configuration file, from a local directory to the remote servers. Okay, so basically what are we doing here? First of all, the original file is in the role directory in a special subdirectory called files, which is used for this kind of things by convention. And then we are uploading into etc MySQL, but we are giving the file the name of the same name has the host name. Okay. These could be useful sometimes if we want to have several configuration files. Each of them can be included by a sort of master configuration file, which is always my.cnf. And in this way, we can define special aspects of the configuration which depend on specific host. But this is not the best idea. So it is much better to do it in this way. So you can see we are using a different module, which is template. The source, so the template file, is located in a directory called templates by convention, which we are calling my.cnf.j2. Again, it's just a convention, and it means that the template is written in a template language called Jinja 2. Well, it's called Jinja version 2. And the file, of course, must be uploaded to the remote server in ECT MySQL my.cnf. Here you can see how the template looks like. It's not realistic. We are defining only 3 variables, but for this example, we didn't need more complex stuff. So you can see we can hard code certain variables if we think that they will never change. Actually, if we need to change them, we can. But for variables that probably will need to change or may need to change in the future, we should probably use variables, as you can see in this example. But there are some problems. If we want to set a variables, it would be better to be able to add it in only one place, which could be host vars or group vars. And also, the template written in this way is not really dynamic, right? We have to list all the variables that we want to set. If we have many templates, well, it can be quite inconvenient. So here is a better way to make a template, in my opinion. Not everyone uses this technique, but this is something I really suggest. So in host vars, in the files of the variables, we can create a list of dictionaries, okay? Or if you prefer this terminology, an array of objects. In YML, we prefer to say a list of dictionaries, which is Python terminology. So the list is called group MySQL variables, and each dictionary contains 2 attributes: name, which is the name of the variable, and then value, which is the value we want to assign to that variable. And in host vars, the first list should be created in group vars. In host vars, we can create a separate list with specific variables that we want to set for that particular host. And then the template will look like this. What we are doing here is to use the for directive to loop over these lists and print for each element of the list, we print the variable name equals the variable value. The second list may exist or not. It will exist for some hosts and it will not exist for others. So we put it into an if, because basically if the list is not defined, we don't want Ansible to fail. Some notes. Why can't we use the same list in group vars and in host vars? Well, because if we do so, the list in host vars would actually override the list in group vars completely, and we don't want that. Obviously, you probably noticed that already. Some variables may appear twice in the configuration file, because maybe they appear in group vars but also in host vars. This is fine, because for MySQL, the last occurrence of a variable will override the previous one. Okay, so it is not nice to see something like that, but it is very good for automation. So here I show another possible use for lists, and the use is, well, we can have a list of the IPs of the servers that compose a Galera cluster. Okay, so this list should appear in the wsrep cluster address variable, should be comma separated. So you can see it in the example, right? We have this private IPs list. We pipe its content to a filter called join, and basically it becomes a comma separated list. Then I show that we can also, for example, use another syntax to only use the first element of the list. So in this example, we decide that the first listed IP is used as a donor, okay, in the cluster. If you know Galera, you know what I'm talking about. Otherwise you don't, but hopefully you will understand what I wanted to show. And then the last block, well, basically we are deciding that only the first node of a cluster should import a backup when the cluster is created. So we have this task called import backup, and we have a special attribute called when. When decides if the task should be applied or not, and it is applied only if the first IP in the list is equal to the host name as it is specified in the inventory. Sorry, no, my mistake. If it is equal to the IP of the current host, okay? So it will be applied only to the first host in the cluster. I wanted to show here that it can be important to validate variables. I know that most people don't do this, but well, here I show a couple of examples. First of all, I validate the cluster size. As you can see, I'm using the length filters. I check that the result is greater than 0. In the second example, I validate every item in the list cluster hosts. You can see the special with items attribute, and I say that each item should be a valid IP address. As you can see, I can set a fail message. This is very useful because if something fails validation, I should know why it is happening. This will help me to debug a role or to debug the variables I modified in a group or in a host. And then we can optionally have a success message. It can be useful or not. One more word. Why is it important to validate variables? Well, because you could have many variables to set when you add a group or when you add a host. It can be easy for complex infrastructure to forget something or to do something wrong. Debugging could take time, but if we have proper validation in place, and the validation is done at the beginning of a role application, well, this can potentially save us a lot of time. Okay, let's talk about tags and similar features. Okay, we can have conditional tasks. So certain tasks may only be run for certain servers and not for others. Usually this is based on the group, the role, of course, but sometimes even inside a certain role we want to only execute some tasks and exclude others. So in this example we use again the when attribute. Basically the task itself is executed only if there is a isReplica variable which is set to true. Okay, if this is the case, a MySQL variable is set using the MySQL variables module. Sometimes this avoids the need to create multiple roles which are very similar, right? And basically, instead of creating roles MariaDB and MariaDB replica, we can create only one role called MariaDB, and we can have some conditional tasks in it. Sometimes it is a good idea, sometimes it is not. It depends on your specific case. We can also have these optional tasks grouped into separate files. Okay, so in this case, if isReplica is set to true, we include a playbook called replica.yml, otherwise not. So most modules are idempotent. I explained this at the beginning of the session. This means that you can run a task like the following multiple times safely, right? Because we are specifying that a service, well, okay, the example is incomplete because I'm not specifying the service name, but in any case, I'm specifying that the service must be started. If the service is already running, nothing happens. But sometimes we want to make a task non-idempotent on purpose. And you can see an example. For example, we update the file my.cnf, and to make sure it is read, we want to restart MariaDB in the following task. Okay, so we declare that the service is restarted. So if the service was not started, of course it gets started, but if the server is already running, it is restarted anyway. Okay, so this is something that will be done every time. But sometimes we would like a task to be idempotent, but it is not possible. Why? Why? Well, you can see three examples here. The first runs a shell command. The second runs a script. The third runs a query in MySQL. In all these cases, Ansible has no way to find out if the task was applied before, because it cannot understand shell commands, it knows nothing about your scripts, and it doesn't understand SQL queries. So it finds these tasks and it runs them every time. Fortunately, Ansible supports tasks. Okay, we can assign a list of tags optionally to our tasks. So in this case, well, we have several tasks. One of them is update time zone info, which basically updates the information about time zones in MySQL, which is useful if you use certain SQL functions. And we have this tag tzinfo minus update. Why is it useful? Because you can see the example command that we can use to apply not the whole role, but just the specific tags with, the specific tasks with this tag. Okay, so basically we can run a command to only update the time zone info. Okay, so it is useful to have several tags, for example, to modify configuration, to upgrade MySQL, to modify the MySQL users, and so on. Well, actually, you can see some of the typical tags that I want to have. I said that tasks can be used to update MySQL configuration, but actually there are two cases. In one case, we can do it runtime. It is the MySQL config dynamic update tag. Okay. Basically, we can do it by simply running a query in MySQL. But sometimes we want to update the configuration in the configuration file. So we have to copy the new version of the file and then restart MySQL. And for that, we may want to create a separate tag. So there is a way, which I already shown, to selectively run certain tasks. But what if we want to selectively exclude certain tasks? Well, there is no built-in way in Ansible, but we can do it anyway. So here is an example. We have some task that does something, then we have a task to restart MySQL, and then in this task we have the when attribute. Basically, we check if a variable exists, a variable called MySQL restart, and if it is set to true. Okay, we don't want to define such a variable in a file, right? Because this is something we optionally use one time. Okay, for example, I'm doing a specific change, I'm applying specific changes, and for this time I want MySQL to be restarted. I can do it by passing an environment variable. To do it, I can use the syntax that you can see here. So basically it is the parameter in Ansible playbook. If you are already familiar with Docker or Kubernetes, I think you have exactly the same syntax in those technologies. So, thank you very much for attending. Um, if you have asked questions in the chat, I'm going to answer them uh, as more as possible. And if you didn't, please ask your questions, and I will be very happy to reply. So, thank you, and see you next time.
Hey, Federico Razzoli. Good morning.
Hi,
Welcome
Shiv.
to MinervaDB Athena 2020. Good to have you here, man.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, Shiv, and congrats for organizing this wonderful event.
Thank you. So, first of all, let me thank you from MinervaDB Athena team and personally for signing up for this conference, speaking, and your continuous effort in exchanging your knowledge, your experience to the whole community. That makes an impact. So, thanks a lot for that, man.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned this because actually I think that sharing knowledge is something very important, and fortunately it's something also very common in our community. So I'm glad to contribute this good community habit.
Can't agree more with you on that. So let me first start with your topic, which you have presented for MinervaDB Athena 2020, which is about DevOps and automation on MySQL and MariaDB infrastructure operations on Ansible. I tell you, this is only one single topic which is about automation and DevOps. We have conversation on performance, we have conversation on scale out, we have conversations on database reliability engineering. So I tell you, this is a unique topic like rest of the topic, but we always talk about automation on the database infrastructure. It came very late. If you really look at back 5 years back, there wasn't any DevOps for database infrastructure. DevOps exists for a longer time, but then automation in database infrastructure came quite late after automating the entire infrastructure operations. So let me start with, how do you see as building a database infrastructure globally distributed and building a DevOps ecosystem on top of it? What were the first points which you consider, and how do you use Ansible for that?
Well, first of all, DevOps is more of a culture than a single professional figure. So a DBA can also work automating things, right? And that's actually something that should happen because typically when databases are managed by DevOps who don't have specific database knowledge, well, they are able to automate things, but they are not able to deal with specific database performance problems, disaster recovering, and these kind of things. So uh, many DBAs are into automation, and those who are not, well, probably they work in companies who don't really need automation, but nowadays it would be better to explore this field. So how do I do it? Well, Ansible, which was the topic of my talk, and you mentioned it, is my preferred tool in most cases. Uh, it's not necessarily always the best because I think that the technology you know best is probably also the one you can use best. So if someone has more skills about, Puppet or something else, then it's possible that Puppet will work best for them. But I believe that Ansible is the best in most cases because it's simple, it's easily extendable, and well, it has a lot of benefits. So when I build a new infrastructure, first of all, the first step is to design it. Design the infrastructure, but also design the automation itself, which is not exactly the same thing. Okay, so once I know which servers I will need, how many of them I will have, and so on, I need to figure out uh, the roles that I will need to assign to those servers, how these roles will have to work together, um, which variables I will need to create to specify the difference between the various servers. And this is very important because if you do it right, well, you you basically did most of the work. So yeah, couple of words maybe I should spend about how to run Ansible, because okay, Ansible is great because it's simple and it basically assumes you know what you are doing. So you are totally allowed to use it in wrong ways, and in some case it can be a good advantage because it allows to do things quicker and to temporarily use some tricks.
Mm.
But at the same time, you should design your infrastructure to use it properly. So for example, I don't suggest to use Ansible on each DevOps laptop. I suggest to have a dedicated host, possibly even two of them for redundancy, but one is usually fine. And everyone who will need to apply roles to make changes in the configuration will do it from that host. This allows you to use some wrapper script, for example, to log who called Ansible, when, um, and for example, the version of the automation that was in place in that moment. And also maybe do some things that are easily forgot, like, for example, pulling from the remote Git repository before applying a role. So yes, these are the suggestions I have for people who have to build a new infrastructure, a new automation in Ansible.
Perfect answer, actually, because no, I was expecting the same. If you really look at when you're looking on rolling out an automation for your MySQL or MariaDB database infrastructure, you are not going to automate everything, but you are building a custom automation principle, and that you are harnessing on Ansible, as we all agree. That's one is the simplicity on how we are going to use. Two is like again the community strength. Three is that once you orchestrate the entire automation cycle, then it is maintainability point of story is even more taken care well. Now,
Mhm.
look at automation as a two components, right? As a multi faced component. One is that a strategy component to that, where I'm looking at like how business is getting benefit with automation, how the cost the cost is coming under control, at least. Like I'm not talking about bringing cost reduction on automation, but at least you have a cost control on managing infrastructure with the growth or at scale. Plus, now you look at from a technology point of view, like like now you are able to roll out more complex infrastructure faster with lesser error, or it's more simple from from an management point of view. So how do you combine these two? Like an organization, me as an end customer of you come to you like, hey, Federico, this is something which I want to automate my database infrastructure. You come up with Ansible, and what will be the top 3 benefits I get as a business, and top 3 benefits I get from a technology standpoint of view.
Okay. Well, the benefits of business and technologies are, in my opinion, usually the same, just seen from different perspectives. So I would say the first thing is less errors, which you mentioned. So if I have to set up 3 servers manually, it's very likely that I will make at least one mistake, right? If I have automation in place, this will not happen. So this is a benefit from technological point of view, but from business point of view, I would say it means you don't spend resources to fix problems after creating them. You save resources because you avoid creating the problem in the first place, right? And well, of course, if I make mistakes, this can also mean that maybe, I don't know, my server will be slower because I misconfigured something, and a slow server also has a cost in terms of, slow website, users that will abandon a website. So this is a big thing, actually. Second benefit I want to mention is, I can deploy servers much more quickly, because if I have to deploy a certain number of servers, I will need some hours, right? But if I can do it by simply applying a role, an Ansible role, it will be very quick. Of course, Ansible cannot make magic. Okay, so if the role implies that the server has to install a package from a remote repository, this will take some time, but it's still nothing compared to the time we save, because I don't have to connect to the servers myself, run every command myself, and so on. So actually, this also means that work is quicker, yes, but it's also more pleasant, right? Because doing the same things over and over, and then spending time and having headaches to find out what you did wrong at some point, it can be frustrating. So it improves the quality of life of DevOps and DBAs. So yes, okay, this is a technological benefit, but the business part is also quite obvious, because if DevOps can do their tasks quickly, they will be free to do something else after some minutes. So yeah, another great benefit I would mention is that if I automate my operations, everything becomes more testable, because I have the same role which I can apply to a test server. It configures the test server in a certain way. I can run my tests, or I can simply leave the server going for some time, because maybe it's a replica, so I will just check if it survive its workload. And once I decide to recreate a server, the same kind of server in production, I will just change I will just set some variables for production, because something will probably be a bit different, but hopefully not many things. And then I will apply the role, and I will be absolutely sure that it is exactly the same server. So if I did my tests correctly, everything will work. Well, real life is always a bit more complicated, but mostly everything will work.
I understand you technically, because when you are spending your human capital for non-repetitive tasks, that means that you're building much more innovative organization. For a business, it is like they're not spending their people, their knowledge, capital of the business on doing the task which they've been doing for several times. So by automation, you're giving an opportunity for the team to come up with something new, and they can be innovative as well. They can be productive.
Yes,
Now, do you want to
absolutely.
share?
We can say it's a more rational way to employ human beings and their skills.
Do you want to share with us some story of the real life business scenario where you have transitioned a business or database infrastructure from fully human managed to automated database infrastructure? Could be 90%, it could be 50%, but then anything makes an impact, because like completely human driven to an automation managed or harnessed database infrastructure. You want to share with us that story? That'll be great.
Yes, I have more than one, but probably the most interesting is a work which is currently in progress, almost finished, still in progress. Basically, a customer required initially something different. They wanted to switch from Amazon Aurora to Galera cluster, and basically running it on EC2 machines. And while doing this, what I proposed was, okay, but please, let's use this opportunity to rebuild your infrastructure in a optimal way and automate everything. So what I said the customer at some point was, I will not deliver you some random servers. Well, yes, there will be some random servers, but what the most valuable thing I will deliver you are the playbooks, the roles to make servers run. Okay, so the thing is, you will not just have a server that is doing its work, and if it goes down, the work must be redone. You will have what you need to rebuild the server as needed, to add new nodes if needed by simply applying some Ansible roles, and so on. So this is the most interesting thing, and probably I hope you will read something about it on the database website when it's done. Other stories are about automating infrastructure starting from test servers. Okay, so another customers which I will not mention, sorry, basically asked specifically to automate their infrastructure, and we started from test servers, which was not what they initially asked, but I did it for the reasons I mentioned before. So basically, I built some servers that contained their test databases. They could test their apps to initially see if everything was working, and then fine-tune the configuration to improve performance. And then once everything was in place, we used this automation initially to automate the deployment of new replicas, because it was the intermediate step, right? Replicas were used in production for read-only connections, which is less critical than writes, of course. Once they were sure that everything was working fine and the performance were good, we basically deployed new masters to have them fully automated with Ansible. And what they were particularly surprised was what I mentioned before. So if they want to change something, including, for example, a version of some software, what they have to do is to change a variable, for example, change a version number, and then apply the role again. And they don't have to connect to the server to run commands and to do a lot of stuff. Just change a value and apply again.
Yeah, this is what we call as a transition, right? A transition from um, highly repetitive, highly human human effort involved operations infrastructure to you categorize them what is going to be an automated task and what's going to be a human involved activity. So eventually you're making a DBA, or the database infrastructure owner, so strategic component also. When I say strategic component, why? Because is that you are looking at like how I can build this database infrastructure for a scale. Like when the organization grow bigger in size, does that mean that we spend hiring more number of people, or we are going to scale the database infrastructure operations with eyeballs, which is definitely not the way to grow your database infrastructure. One, like there is a shortage of talented people. Two is about the cost of having them. Three is like about the cost of losing them due to the higher attrition in the database systems professionals ecosystem. So well put.
Yes.
Do you want to give some recommendations for somebody who is starting as a DBA now, right? How they should plan involving the automation as an activity in parallel from the day one they start. Like, what do you guide for somebody who's starting database infrastructure operations from the day one, right?
Okay. My best advice is, once you are sure that you know the technologies you want to deploy, make sure you understand Ansible and how it works, because this will save you a lot of mistakes. Okay, so it's interesting, for example, to check Ansible questions on websites like Stack Overflow, because you can easily find questions about how to do things that shouldn't be done. So, for example,
Very important, very important. Yeah.
yes, just to give you an example, they ask, how can I share the same variable between different roles? And they are thinking about, a special way of declaring a variable in a role and then having another role which accesses somehow, but that's absolutely not how Ansible works. So what you will do is to have variables that describe the aspects of your servers that you need to describe. Okay, so the first thing to decide is, which aspects do I actually need to decide. I put them into variables, and then I need to have roles that access those variables. Of course, this partly means that you don't completely use ready-made roles. Okay, but actually you do, But what you typically do, what I suggest to do at least, if your deployments are not trivial, use an existing role as a template and then modify it, because every infrastructure is different and your needs are not the same needs of the author of that role. So
Absolutely.
yeah, make sure you fully understand Ansible and how it works, and then start to use it designing your infrastructure properly.
Thank you. So that's all the questions from me. Thank you so much in giving us the detailed interpretation of each and every point of your conversation when it comes to automation on Ansible for MySQL and MariaDB database infrastructure, giving us the clarity like what a database infrastructure owner should look forward to on automating their database maintenance activities, which will add benefit to the business. And so is for the technology infrastructure. Thank you so much, Federico Razzoli, joining this call on a short notice, taking time for the talk, sharing your experience and story. Wishing you a Merry Christmas in advance, a great 2021 in advance. Take care, stay safe, man. Pleasure talking to you.
And thank you for inviting me, and thank you also for organizing this great event, and hope to meet you and the community in person very soon.
Looking forward to it, man. Thank you.
Bye bye.